If you ache for truth, goodness, and beauty, if you're hungry for a Christianity with substance and strength, if you long for a faith that's big and bold and biblical and all about Jesus Christ, if you're inspired by the idea of one church that has spanned 20 centuries, 24 time zones, and 2 hemispheres, enfolding every race, nation, and language, then you're considering Catholicism.
So, Ed, we just tacoed.
We did.
We decided that's a verb now.
Yeah.
To taco would be the infinitive. Yeah. Like, I taco.
Yeah.
You taco.
To taco or not to taco. Yeah.
Yeah, he, she, it tacoed.
Right.
Tacos.
What were you doing? I was tacoing.
I was tacoing. We shall taco. There's all those different like verb forms. Like we will be tacoing in the future. In a continuous. I don't know. I forgot all the verb forms, but
could never keep that straight.
I always have felt that one of the fundamental flaws of the English language is that it doesn't have a second person plural. Like in a lot of languages, a lot of Romance languages like Spanish or whatever, there's a second person plural. If you're saying you to a group of people. Oh. And this is why I believe that Texas and the American South has fundamentally solved this. And a lot of people say, oh, it sounds stupid when they say y'all. But actually, y'all is pretty developed because it's a second person plural form when I am addressing a group of you. So I can say, Ed and I tacoed. Have y'all tacoed lately?
Or one of my favorites, yous. Have yous gone down to the? Have yous gone down to the new thing? Yeah,
that's more like kind of New Jersey or something like that.
It's a clear second. You know.
Yeah, between New Jersey and Texas, I side with Texas on this one and the South because I like. Okay, Ed and I have tacoed.
Correct.
And then I'm saying this to our listeners here. Have y'all tacoed lately?
We taco, therefore. We podcast.
Now, some of you are like, I don't even know what you're talking about. To taco is to consume tacos. So Ed and I went out and we just had a lunch of tacos.
I think a case could be made that we don't know what we're talking about.
Pretty clearly. So let's talk
about,
not taco, but
let's talk
about something that we also know nothing about.
Right.
Because that's never stopped us before.
Let's talk about the Pope. He's been in the news as of this recording. He's been sick. He's been in the hospital almost 2 weeks. He's double pneumonia, although I heard that he had half of one lung out. He's been in and out. He's a little kidney trouble. And so it's been all over the news, right? How is the Pope doing? The vigil and all that. And so is he going to die now or hang on longer? We don't know, but eventually he'll die. And when he does,
Pope Francis is an 88-year-old man, as you say, when I think he was a teenager or something, like most of one of his lungs was removed. So he has 1 1/4 lungs or something. And as from what I'm reading the same things that you are on the news, he apparently has some kind of infection in his lungs and pneumonia, and they got a blood transfusion and there's like kidney problems or something. Right. And so he's an 88-year-old man with multiple health conditions. And we pray for the Pope. We've been praying for him here at church and praying for him personally. I've been praying for him myself that he would recover. And I hear today he's doing better. But again, he's an 88-year-old man with multiple health conditions. So at some point, like all of us, until the Lord returns, he'll pass.
So being not yet a Catholic, being a man with no country here, I'm curious about this. And I suppose I could have Googled this or grokked it or whatever, but talk to me about so eventually he dies today, next year, whenever. What's the process for getting the new guy in?
Yeah, and it's fascinating. Let's be honest. It's fascinating because it's an old process. It's a lot of elements of it go back to the Middle Ages or earlier, much earlier. And I think all of us, nobody wants to see, the Pope die, obviously, but the process is fascinating. It's an old historical process, in some ways shrouded in mystery and pomp.
Yep,
and
with the white smoke and the black
palace
smoke and all that.
Intrigue and all these kinds of interesting things. The first thing, we I've followed this a bit over the years, but I also, checked online today, make sure I had all my ducks in a row before I said this, because it is complicated. The first thing that will happen when the Pope passes, and again, we're praying that's not soon, but whenever that occurs, is obviously they need to confirm his death. And that's a modern thing, but it was also very important in the Middle Ages or earlier to confirm.
They couldn't put him on a monitor.
Yeah. And so there's a guy. So the first thing to understand about this whole process is there is a position in the papal household called Carmelengo, who's basically like a steward of the papal household. And not like a butler, but more like the chief of staff type of person. And the Carmelengo, who's currently actually an American cardinal named Kevin Farrell, he verifies the death. And there's this old tradition where they used to use a silver hammer. So they would actually come and like bonk the guy on the forehead with a silver hammer 3 times to see if he responded.
If I die before you do, will you come and do that? You freak out my family.
Absolutely.
You've been wanting to anyway.
I've been wanting to use Maxwell's silver hammer fell down upon his head.
Yeah, you could play that song.
Yeah, that was this traditional way, because obviously if somebody's they're just sleeping or passing out. Right. Okay, now I don't think they use the silver hammer. That was an old 1,000-year-old way of verifying. Now they do, I guess they shine the flashlight in your eyes and they do the various kind of things. But the most important thing here is that they verify death. And once they do, there's a couple of things that immediately happen. And one is all popes have a ring, like a papal signet ring. Mm-hmm. It's called the Ring of the Fisherman.
Yep.
And I'll get to that again later because I think it's interesting. But the papal signet ring is called the Ring of the Fisherman because, of course, he's the successor of St. Peter, who was a fisherman.
Right.
So he has the signet ring, and it's unique to each pope. Each pope has his coat of arms, and theoretically that's used to seal wax documents. You know how in the movies where they used to do that, seal it? I don't know how much sealing they actually do now, but part of the tradition is at the Pope's verification of his death, the Carmelengo then smashes or breaks the papal signet ring.
Okay.
The fisherman's ring, because that way nobody can falsify documents.
There you go. Yeah.
Once he's dead, nobody can then start sealing with wax documents. The ring is broken and the seal is broken, so his reign is ended. Nothing else can happen in his name. And then the Carmelengo seals the papal apartments. You have whatever documents in there, the space where basically the Pope's room, his private spaces, that's all sealed in anticipation of whoever will occupy it next. Now, something that's interesting about Pope Francis is that in the Vatican, and remember the Vatican is a complex of buildings. It includes St. Peter's Basilica, or it's adjacent to St. Peter's Basilica. But when they speak of the Vatican, it's this area, it's 400 acres. We've talked about this before. It's like a little country, sovereign state in the middle of Rome. And it has a number of buildings in this complex. The Sistine Chapel is in there, the Vatican museums. But part of it is what's called the Apostolic Palace. And in the Apostolic Palace were the papal apartments. So if you would think about like in the White House or something, there would be is it not the West Wing? There's the Residence Wing. Or for the British, there's like number 10 Downing Street, which is where the home of the Prime Minister. So the papal apartments there. Now, what's interesting with Pope Francis is that he chose not to live in the papal apartments there. There is a dormitory building in the Vatican complex, St. Martha's House, I think it's called. Okay. And it's like a dormitory or apartment building, like a conference center. Right. And it's usually used for, the biggest thing it's used for is when the cardinals come for the conclave, that's where they all stay. Okay. So it's got like hotel rooms in it, and a dining hall and whatnot. When Pope Francis was elected Pope 12 years ago, and he stayed in one of the apartments there, when they elected him, he said, I'm not going to move next door into the apostolic apartment. I just want to be a humble
Right.
Pope, and I'm just going to stay and live here in this St. Marta's dormitory building.
Right.
And that way, when people come and go, because people are always traveling through, cardinals and bishops and important people are always coming and
Right.
going. And that way I can kind of be in the middle of things rather than locked up there. So I think that's interesting because when Pope Francis passes, they'll seal up his room in this dormitory building or whatever. So that's an interesting tradition.
Yeah.
And then there's a 9-day period of mourning, during which the funeral and all that happens.
Would they have given him, last mass, last rites, last confession, all this stuff?
Before he passes.
He would go through all of that when they knew he was.
Yeah, when his doctors think he's close, just like any of us would. But once it's verified that he's dead, the Carmelengo, like I said, seals the room, does all this kind of stuff, and this 9-day mourning period in which the funeral. And the 9 days is important because they're not going to move on to choosing a new pope until that's over with.
Okay.
So during that time, you're going to have funeral preparations. And some of that's obvious. The body is blessed. It's dressed in the vestments they'll wear for the funeral. And then a lot of important people, he lies in state. Like when a president dies, he lies in state in the Capitol Rotunda. Or in the case of the Pope, he lies in state in St. Peter's Basilica.
Okay.
And then people can stream through and visit.
It's got to be a huge crowd.
Oh, I imagine hundreds to thousands of people will stream through over however many days that lasts. Now, Pope Francis has already said that for his funeral, he wants a simple funeral. And some of the papal funerals in the past were very elaborate because he's not only the head of the church, he's the head of state. And so they were elaborate like a lot of state funerals would be. So Pope Francis has already published his will or whatever, stated that he wants an open wooden coffin, doesn't want an elaborate, kind of coffin that you would have for a VIP. And he wants his body prepared a little differently. So, when they do the embalming and they remove the organs, he doesn't want that. Basically, he just wants to be laid in a wooden coffin for a few days. People stream through, and then he'll be entombed. The funeral is usually held 4 to 6 days after the death.
That's partway through the 9-day mourning.
Yeah.
All right. Yep.
And there'll be a mass in St. Peter's Square, and thousands of people will attend, including, I'm sure, heads of state, president, vice president, kings, prime ministers, everybody, all the VIPs around the world will fly in. And I'm sure millions and millions of people watch it on TV, of course. Now, typically a lot of popes are buried in St. Peter's Basilica. So when you go to Rome as a tourist to visit St. Peter's Basilica, there are all kinds of papal tombs inside of it, some on the main floor, where when you first walk in the sort of the front door of St. Peter's Basilica and you look to your right, the first thing is Michelangelo's Pietà.
Mm-hmm.
And then right past that on the right side there is the tomb of St. John Paul II.
Okay.
And then a little deeper in on the right side, towards the middle, there's the tomb of Pope John Paul XXIII, and there's this pope and that pope. And then when you go downstairs to the floor below that, there's like dozens and dozens of popes' tombs that they're buried there. But there are popes buried in other places throughout the city of Rome and in other churches. So not all the popes are buried there. Pope Francis has said he does not want to be buried in St. Peter's Basilica. He wants to be buried in one of the other papal basilicas in Rome, which is St. Mary Major.
Is that in the Vatican City?
No, it's in the city of Rome. It's one of the 4 papal. Gets super complicated, but there are 4 papal basilicas in Rome: St. Peter's, St. Paul's, where St. Paul is entombed, St. John Lateran, and St. Mary Major on the Esquiline Hill. And St. Mary Major, you can walk there. I've walked between the two things dozens of times. Maybe it's a 45-minute walk or something like that. It's 3 miles or whatever. Right. And St. Mary Major is a basilica that goes back to, I don't know, like the year 400 or something. It's really remarkable. We could talk all about it, but that's where he wants his
Okay.
tomb to be. And there's other popes in there as well. Once that's over, when the pope is buried, there'll be this interregnum, which is usually around 15 to 20 days. So the 9 days of mourning have ended. But then you have to assemble the College of Cardinals, okay? And there's 15 to 20 days they're allowing for cardinals to travel from all around the world.
Because they're all over the place. Right?
Yeah, now some of these traditions go back because, of course, before we had air travel, I mean, you can get almost anywhere in the world, in a day. But travel arrangements need to be made and this and that. Some of them may undoubtedly will be there for the funeral, but then they need to go home for a week to take care of things before they come back. And plus, you need to make arrangements for the cardinals and the conclave and just logistical things. So there'll be this period. And during this papal interregnum, which is what it's called, no major decisions can be made. So in other words, like the deep state, the Vatican administrators can't, like, it's what do you call it? A holding, or what would you call it? There's a moratorium.
Okay.
On any big decisions being made. It's just a time when we are between popes. Okay.
Right.
So after a couple of weeks, they get everybody in town and they have everything ready, and then they go into conclave. Okay. Thanks for listening. My name is Greg Smith, and I'm so grateful for my guests, those who leave ratings and reviews on the podcast platforms, and all of you who share the podcast with others. I really love to hear your thoughts, your questions, and your stories. So email me at consideringcatholicism@gmail.com or leave a comment or review on the website at consideringcatholicism.com. This podcast doesn't take ad revenue, and it doesn't make money on clicks. It is 100% supported by donors who believe in this ministry. And to my donors, I want to thank you because you keep me going. You help me cover my costs, and you let me dedicate more time to researching, writing, recording, and editing to get the episodes out to you faster and to engage the community of listeners who send in their questions and comments. I entirely trust the Lord to provide through you. And if you aren't already a supporter, would you consider giving a one-time or recurring donation through the links in the show notes or on the website so this ministry can continue and grow and help others to consider Catholicism? Thank you, and now back to the show. Now, the conclave is this college of cardinals that chooses the new pope, and they meet in the Sistine Chapel. Yes, the famous Sistine Chapel where Michelangelo painted the ceiling and then also the altar wall with the Last Judgment. And I've been in there any number of times. The Sistine Chapel isn't as big as you think or would imagine. It's maybe if you had a basketball auditorium in your college or something like that, high school. It's not like going to a big NBA professional thing where you can seat 40,000 people. If you just imagine like your local college, the field house, the floor or something like that, where they play basketball, it's just not that big. That's the Sistine Chapel. And it's in that Vatican complex of buildings next to the Apostolic Palace and St. Peter's. And that's where they hold it. And then they do all kinds of things. And they sweep it for bugs and electronic listening devices and all that. And then they got to set up whatever the logistics, the furniture and this and that. Back in the old days, they used to make the cardinals sleep in there. But now they sleep they stay in that dormitory building a few hundred feet away. Right. But they go in there and then they lock the doors during the day. Right. And so they put in chairs, all that kind of thing for them. And the College of Cardinals. So here's what cardinals are: bishops that have been given a designation of cardinal. They get a red hat. And the main thing about being a cardinal is that you are potentially eligible to vote in a conclave for a new pope.
You're not automatically?
Here's the stipulation. You have to be under 80 years old. So cardinals that are over 80 can't vote in the conclave.
Okay. If you're a bishop and a cardinal, do you still do a bishop's job?
Yes. In some cases, yes and no. So in other words, there are bishops or archbishops who receive a red hat and then continue to operate their diocese or their archdiocese.
Yep.
So like in America, you might say Cardinal Dolan is pretty famous. He's the cardinal or the Archbishop of New York.
Okay. Yep.
And so he runs the Archdiocese of New York, but he is a cardinal. And there's a few others like that in
Right.
America. Other cardinals are given jobs in the Vatican. So there's a number of like particular positions in the Vatican administration. So some bishops will be made a cardinal and in a sense promoted or recruited to be part
Right.
of the papal administration. But the point is that cardinals are people who are potentially eligible to vote if they are under 80 years old.
Okay.
Okay. So once you might get made a cardinal at 70, but once you
Right.
hit 80, I think the theory here is beyond a certain age, you're not invested in the future, maybe.
So I've got like a little while yet before I
Yeah, you got
would
a little
be
while.
ineligible.
But you're actually, yeah, okay. We'll get to that.
I got a lot of work to do. Yeah.
Cardinals under 80, and the rules say there cannot be more than 120 electors.
Okay.
Right now, I think that's what they've got. They've got 120 cardinals that are under 80 years old. And they do all these security sweeps. And when they're in the conclave, they have no contact with the outside world. So they have little airport shuttle vans.
Yeah.
Like from where the dormitory is in the Vatican to
Yep.
where the Sistine Chapel is maybe, I don't know, 300, 400 yards or whatever. These guys are old men too.
Right.
Like they have these little airport shuttle vans that like come up to the door where the Sistine Chapel is and drive them over to the dorms. And then they go in there at night and they're supposed to be like cut off from the outside world. No contact, no press conferences, no
Yep.
whatever. So they're locked.
You don't want to see them on CNN.
No,
Yeah.
they're supposed to be isolated and in
Right.
isolation while they make this decision. And they go in during the day, and then on the first day they start the voting. And the voting process is, I think, interesting. So you don't have a slate of candidates like we have. If you have a presidential election or parliamentary election, or heck, if you have elections for class president at your high
Right.
school or whatever, you might say, okay, here's the 4 nominees.
Right.
What happens on the first ballot when they go in that first day and they lock the door of the Sistine Chapel is apparently every cardinal there, all 120 of them, will get a sheet of paper, and he's supposed to write on that sheet of paper his choice to be
Mhm.
pope. Then they collect them all.
Yep.
Okay. And then they read the names. So as you go through and you read the names, you're going to see that this one guy only got one
Right.
person wrote his name down, but there's another guy that like 20 people wrote his name down. So you go, okay, nobody has reached a majority or consensus or whatever. So now we'll go to a second ballot. And I think the way it is that there's one ballot on the first day, and then starting the second day, there's 2 ballots in the morning and 2 ballots in the afternoon. So 4 ballots a
What
day.
keeps them from getting gridlocked and just voting for the same guys over and over? Did they discard?
Well, and that's theoretically possible. It's happened in the past where you have conclaves that go on for a really long time because nobody can get a majority.
But typically, if you were a cardinal and you were voting and they read off this one guy only got 1 vote, then you'd say to yourself, I'm not going to waste my time.
Yeah, I think that's the idea, is that they are, on the one hand, they're listening to the Holy Spirit. They're listening to
Right.
each other. You can say, oh, here's something interesting to toss in at this point. Who's eligible to be pope?
Mm,
So it's usually a cardinal. It's usually one of them.
okay.
But the actual rules say any baptized Catholic.
Wow.
Theoretically, you don't even need to be a priest.
So if I got my act together,
If you were to enter the Catholic Church, if you make the
Yeah.
decision here and get this done, Ed,
yes, sir.
theoretically, you would no longer be Ed the Protestant. You'd
Right.
be Ed the Catholic, and they could write your name down, and you could be Pope Ed. I
Yeah.
mean, theoretically, unlikely, but right. So let's suppose in some strange alternative
Yeah.
timeline,
Yeah.
Ed gets it done with RCA here, Wiki
Yeah.
lickety split. Pope Francis lives another year. Ed gets through RCA. Pope Francis passes. The cardinals go into the conclave. They get locked in the Sistine Chapel. And for some reason,
They've all been listening to the
unfathomable only,
podcast.
they've all been listening. Or there's one cardinal who's listening to the podcast and writes down Ed the Catholic. And then they read all the names and someone says, Ed the Catholic. And everyone goes, who's that? And he's going to stick with it, right? I guess he could stick with it. We're joking. There are, I guess, this process by doing basically 4 ballots a day, 2 in the morning and then 2 in the afternoon, is that you start seeing certain names emerge.
Is this in lieu of discussion and debate?
No, apparently they do a lot of discussion in there.
Okay.
A lot
All
of
right.
back and forth, but they're locked in, so those discussions are
Right.
We don't see them or hear them.
But they are. They're saying, what about this guy? What about that? Here's why I think this guy is good.
Yeah.
Okay.
Apparently they're in there and they're talking and they're praying and they're doing this and that's going back and forth, and they go, okay, let's take another vote. And so you start to see, now there have been conclaves that went on for a really long time, because maybe through these multiple ballots at 4 a day, you could go on for 10 days and have 40 ballots theory. And this is going on and on. Maybe there's 2 or 3 different names and nobody really can get a majority. And maybe there are different sides that are really dug in around a certain candidate or a certain name. And so this process is somewhat mysterious, but they're like, okay, let's vote again. Let's vote again. Maybe a better analogy for this than like a presidential election or parliamentary election would be like if you're ever on a jury.
Yeah.
And the jury is got to come up with a jury verdict, and you're locked in the jury room.
Right.
And you're locked in this room and people are dug into the guilty or the not guilty thing. And you just banter around after day until
you figure it out.
So you get to this consensus.
So it's 120 electors max. What if there's 130 cardinals? Who decides?
I think the way that's managed, as I understand it, the number of cardinals he's appointed, he's appointed up to that number or something like that.
Okay. So there isn't 150 of them.
No, I think I read this morning that currently there's 139, but like 19 of them are over 80 years old.
Oh, okay. Otherwise, you get to be an alternate like the jury.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So in any case, is this mysterious process of going back and forth and back and forth. And by the way, there have been some conclaves that went on so long, like in history. That's where the black and white smoke thing, we'll get to that in a second, emerged, because people are like, what's going on in there? What's going on in there? And that's where they ended up, I think way back, like in the Middle Ages, locking him in the Sistine Chapel became a thing. Actually, it wasn't the Middle Ages. It was because the Sistine Chapel didn't exist in the Middle Ages. It was later than that in the Renaissance. But the point is, at some point, because the cardinals were taking all summer, they're like months. And in the meanwhile, there was no pope. And not only was that just a crisis for, we want to have a pope for spiritual matters, but this was back when there were the papal states. And the Pope was also the head of a civil country.
And there were things that needed attended.
Things needed to be done. And we were all just in this locked in the thing. So that's where the tradition came of locking them in the Sistine Chapel and going, you guys can't
You're not coming out. Yeah.
You're not coming out until you at least settle this.
Right.
So eventually, through all this back and forth, they end up with something. And by the way, these 4 votes a day are written in these ballots. And then after they read them, they burn them. And that's where this tradition of the white smoke or the black smoke came. So there's like a little stove or like a potbelly type stove type thing that they put into the Sistine Chapel. It's not normally there now, but it's in there. And then what they do is they burn the ballots. And if there is no decision, then I think they add a little bit of something to the fire so that it comes out as a black smoke.
Yep.
And then if they have finally landed, the ballots have all landed on a winner, then they add a little bit of white smoke. And that's where 4 times a day you see the smoke come out of the little smokestack at Sistine Chapel.
So people will be out in that big courtyard.
Oh, yeah. The last time when this happened with Pope Francis, there was like live stream cams.
Okay.
You could sit there and look at the smoke on your phone and see when do we have white smoke, because white smoke means that they finally have a ballot that they've got to pick. So once that they get a pick and they've chosen somebody, then the dean of the cardinals, with another position there, will ask the winner, do you accept? Okay, so they've taken this ballot and and now they finally have narrowed it down. And I think they get to the point where it's unanimous. They just keep doing it over. And finally people go, this guy's got it. And then they'll turn to the guy and say, do you accept? Because you've been chosen. And when he does that, he chooses a name.
If it's unanimous, that means he would have been voting for himself.
Yeah, I don't know the nuances of that. Yeah, but I don't know.
That's why I can't be a part of this process.
I guess I could never vote.
Just write my own name down.
But in any case, the important thing is he chooses a new name. because he has a new identity. The idea is that you were Ed the Catholic, but now you're Pope someone's, and you live and operate within that new identity. And so that's always interesting because what name they choose is a little bit of a clue to what their priorities are.
Okay, sure.
So there are some certain names that over time have meaning. For example, the name Pius, okay? There have been several conservative popes, Pius X, Pius XII. So if a new pope says, I want to be Pius XIII, sort of an indication that I'm modeling myself on those people. There have been, John has been a very popular name for popes, and a lot of the John popes have been people who triumphed mercy and kindness and whatever. And so if a new pope says, hey, I want to be John, and Francis is not Francis the First. Pope Francis is just Pope Francis because he's the first one who ever chose the name Francis.
Oh, okay.
So there's never been a Pope Francis up until now. He chose the name after Saint Francis of Assisi, who is known for his humility, and that's what he wanted to signal. So it'll be interesting. He chooses a name, and then you have this really interesting thing where the Pope will come out on the balcony. There's a ceremony. Because no one knows that, they've chosen someone.
Right.
And then over a couple of hours, St. Peter's Basilica fills. And I remember when Pope Francis was chosen, I was so excited when the white smoke came up. I rushed home from work and I just parked myself in front of the big screen TV and I wanted to watch this process because I knew it was history. I was like, this is historical. This is a huge moment in history and I wanted to see. And you knew they've chosen somebody, you don't know who yet. And so they have this moment where they give time for people to assemble.
Yep.
And it's a number of hours or whatever. And St. Peter's Basilica, which can hold like the Basilica, the square there, the piazza, which can hold like 100,000 people.
Yeah.
There's just packed. And then every television camera in the world and everything, everybody's. And then the I don't know if it's the Carmelengo or whoever walks out, or the Dean of the Cardinals walks out onto the balcony and says, Habemus Papa, which means in Latin, we have a Pope. And then they point to the new guy and he walks out wearing the white outfit, white cassock and everything, and they announce his papal name. And then, of course, all the people start to go, oh, that's... And then you go, oh my gosh, that's who they chose. And this is his new name. And then he comes out and he gives a blessing called the Urbi et Orbi blessing, which means from the city to the world. And it's an annual address thing that the Pope does every year, the Urbi et Orbi, which is the notion that from Rome, the eternal city, to the rest of the world. And he gives a big blessing. This is so famous when Pope John Paul II was chosen. This is when he came out and gave that Urbi et Orbi, and he said a few words. And this is where he said, be not afraid. Whatever happens, be not afraid. That became the slogan for his papacy.
I read someplace that there's a crying room for the Pope, the new Pope.
Yeah, I've heard the same thing, that there is this little room off the Sistine Chapel called the Room of Sorrows or something, and that's where he's supposed to put on
the Room of Sorrows, that's what
the new outfit, because his old life is ended and his new identity.
And maybe he wasn't sure he wanted to be Pope, and then now he is, and he's got...
Yeah, he's taken on the hardest job on the planet.
Yep.
And his old life is over. Yep. And his new identity has begun. So that's the process. And again, as you say, we don't know whether, God willing, and we hope that Pope Francis, recovers from his current illness. But again, he's an 88-year-old man. So at some point, whether tomorrow or, as you say, a year from now or whatever, at some point when he passes, this is the process that will take place. Yeah. And it'll be fascinating because there have only been, approximately 270 popes in history over 2,000 years. And it's just going to be, it's a tremendous moment in history. Pope Francis has been Pope for 12 years now.
Yeah.
So that's longer than any reigning president or prime minister. It's been a pretty long administration. It's a big deal. And it's going to be a big deal, and it'll be fascinating to watch.
Cool. I'm looking forward to this. I will also be glued to the news.
Okay, so let's do this. Let's take a quick little break, and then we'll talk about maybe what we might expect from a new pope in terms of changes in the Catholic Church.
I have more questions.
All right.
Thanks for listening. We'll be back with another episode soon. But before you go, can I quickly ask you to do 5 things? First, please rate the podcast on whatever platform you listen on. That really moves it up in search rankings. Second, please write a review on either Apple Podcasts or on our website, consideringcatholicism.com. That encourages others who are searching for a Catholic podcast to try this one out. Third, please share it with others. Send them a link or post an episode on your social media. Fourth, please write me at consideringcatholicism.com or leave a comment on our website. I'd love to hear your comments, your questions, and your stories. And finally, this podcast is 100% donor supported. My donors keep me going, they help cover my costs, and they let me dedicate more time to researching, writing, recording, and editing to get the episodes out to you faster. So please consider giving a one-time or recurring donation through the links in the show notes or on the website so that this ministry can continue and grow. And never forget, Christus vincit, Christus regnat, and Christus imperat.